The gym lights in Baltimore cast long shadows across Gervonta Davis's sweaty face as he unleashed his frustration on the heavy bag. Each punch echoed like a silent scream, carrying the weight of questions that had never found answers. At 29 years old, despite all his fame and success in the boxing world, there was still an emptiness in his chest that no victory could fill. The absence of a father who disappeared when he was just a child. The gym was nearly empty that Thursday night, only the rhythmic sound of his fists against leather and Calvin Ford's heavy breathing breaking the silence. Tank had grown up on the tough streets of Baltimore, where stories of absent fathers were as common as police sirens cutting through the dawn. He had always known that his father, Marcus, had left the family when he was only 5 years old, but he never imagined there were deeper secrets buried in the past. While adjusting the wraps on his hands, Tank thought about the conversation he had with his mother the week before. Kenya had mentioned something about old letters she found by chance in the attic while renovating the house, documents that belonged to Marcus before he disappeared. She seemed nervous, avoiding her son's direct gaze as if she was keeping information that could change everything. Tank knew that expression. It was the same one she made when she hid overdue electricity bills to keep him from worrying as a child. The curiosity ate at Tank from the inside like acid. For years, he had built a mental image of his father as an irresponsible man who simply abandoned the family out of selfishness. This narrative had fed him, serving as fuel for his anger and determination in the ring. Every defeated opponent was a way to prove that he didn't need Marcus, that he had managed to become someone despite his father's absence. But now, with his mother's words echoing in his mind, Tank began to question whether he really knew the whole truth. The letters mentioned by Kenya could contain the answers he had been searching for, or perhaps they would only confirm his worst fears. The boxer stopped training and looked at the gym mirror, seeing reflected not just his face, but also features he had clearly inherited from a man he barely remembered. That night, driving through the familiar streets of Baltimore, Tank made a decision that would change his life forever. He would confront his mother about these mysterious letters and finally discover the whole truth about Marcus Davis, even if it meant facing a reality more complex than he had ever imagined. What he didn't know was that this search for answers would lead him to discover not only his father's secrets, but also the existence of someone who shared his blood and had grown up with the same unanswered questions. Kenya's kitchen seemed smaller than Tank remembered from childhood, perhaps because he now took up more space, or because the weight of the conversation they were about to have made the walls seem to close in around them. His mother nervously stirred a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold, avoiding her son's penetrating gaze. Tank knew she was hiding something important. After decades together, he could read every facial expression of hers better than the movements of his opponents in the ring. The letters were spread across the kitchen table like pieces of a puzzle that Kenya had been trying to put together for weeks. They were old correspondence, some dating back more than 20 years, written in handwriting that Tank immediately recognized as his father's. The yellowed pages told a completely different story from the one he knew. Marcus hadn't simply abandoned the family out of irresponsibility, but was running from a past that haunted him. Kenya finally raised her eyes, and Tank saw tears forming in the corners. She began to tell a story she had kept secret for decades about how Marcus had become a father at 17, 2 years before Tank was born. There was another son, the result of a previous relationship that Marcus had with a young woman named Shanice Williams. The boy was called Damon, and when Tank was born, Marcus was torn between two families that didn't even know of each other's existence. Kenya finally raised her eyes, and Tank saw tears forming in the corners. She began to tell a story she had kept secret for decades about how Marcus had become a father at 17, 2 years before Tank was born. There was another son, the result of a previous relationship that Marcus had with a young woman named Shanice Williams. The boy was called Damon, and when Tank was born, Marcus was torn between two families that didn't even know of each other's existence. The revelation hit Tank like a straight right hook. He had an older brother he never knew existed. Marcus had tried to maintain both families, working multiple jobs and lying to both about his whereabouts during his spare time. The letters revealed the desperation of a young father who felt suffocated by responsibility and terrified by the possibility that his two worlds would collide destructively. As Kenya continued the narrative, Tank discovered that Marcus hadn't disappeared out of selfishness. but because he had been discovered by Shanice. She had demanded that he choose, either stay with her and Damon or lose his son forever. Desperate and unable to make a decision that would destroy either family, Marcus chose a third option: disappear completely, leaving both Tank and Damon without a father, but sparing them the trauma of a violent divorce and the discovery of his lies. Today, Marcus carried in his body and soul more than 50 years of life and the irreparable mistakes of the past. That night, Tank left his mother's house with more questions than answers. He not only had an older brother somewhere in the world, but he also discovered that all the anger he had nurtured toward Marcus for decades was based on an incomplete understanding of the facts. His father wasn't the villain he had imagined, but a scared young man who made desperate decisions in impossible circumstances. Now Tank needed to decide whether to search for Damon Williams, knowing that this search could open old wounds for both of them, or leave the past buried forever. The following days passed like a blur for Tank, who could barely concentrate on training while his mind processed Damon's existence. Calvin Ford noticed the fighter's distraction, but respected his need for space, knowing that Tank would eventually share what was bothering him. Social media became an obsession for the boxer, who spent hours searching for any trace of Damon Williams, a name too common to make the search easy. Tank discovered that Shanice Williams had moved to Richmond, Virginia, a few years after Marcus's disappearance. Through public records and some discreet calls, he managed to track down her current address, but hesitated to make direct contact. What if Damon didn't know about his existence? What if Shanice had created a different narrative about Marcus to protect her son? Tank knew that a sudden call could destroy the peace they had built over the past 2 decades. The solution came through Jerome Washington, a private investigator that Tank hired discreetly. Jerome had experience reuniting separated families and knew how to approach delicate situations without causing additional trauma. He began his investigation subtly, discovering that Damon Williams, now 31 years old, worked as a mechanic at a garage in Norfolk, Virginia, and had 2 young children with his wife, Latasha. What impressed Tank most was discovering the similarities between their lives. Like him, Damon had grown up without a father figure and found his passion in sports, not in boxing, but in basketball, where he excelled during high school before a knee injury ended his dreams of a college scholarship. Like Tank, Damon had become a young father and was determined to be present in his children's lives in a way that Marcus never was for them. Jerome reported that Damon had spent years searching for Marcus, hiring investigators, and consulting public records whenever his financial situation allowed. He didn't know about Tank's existence, but suspected that his father had had other relationships. Shanice had admitted to Damon that Marcus was a man with secrets, but never revealed the complete truth about Baltimore and the second family. Jerome managed to gather information about the family through public social media profiles and professional records from the garage where Damon worked. The most difficult decision of Tank's life was before him. Jerome had located Damon and confirmed that he was open to discovering more about his father, but didn't know if he was prepared to discover that he had a famous brother. Tank realized that it wasn't just about his own desire to meet Damon, but also about the responsibility of revealing a truth that would change his brother's life forever. That night, looking at the photos that Jerome had obtained through Latasha's public social media profiles, Tank saw not just a stranger, but reflections of himself in gestures and expressions that were undeniably familiar. The images showed Damon playing with his children in the backyard, a present father that Tank recognized as the man he himself had strived to become. The Norfolk mechanic shop buzzed with the sound of tools and engines being repaired when Jerome Washington parked his discreet car across the street. He had spent weeks observing Damon Williams' routine, waiting for the right moment to make the initial approach. Damon was a meticulous man in his work, always arriving early and being the last to leave, characteristics that reminded Jerome of Tank's obsessive dedication to training. Jerome decided to use an indirect approach, pretending to need repairs on his vehicle. By watching Damon work, he could personally confirm the physical similarities with Tank, the same face shape, the same intensity in his gaze when concentrated, and especially the same tendency to clench his fists when frustrated. Damon was clearly a Williams, but carried unmistakable traits of the Davis lineage. During casual conversation about the car repair, Jerome casually mentioned that he worked reuniting separated families. Damon immediately stopped what he was doing, his hands getting dirty with grease while firmly holding the tool. His eyes lit up with a mixture of hope and skepticism. He had been disappointed by false alarms before, investigators who promised answers but delivered only more questions. Jerome chose his words carefully, revealing that he had found information about Marcus Davis through records in Baltimore. He showed one of the old letters, the one where Marcus mentioned having divided responsibilities and feeling lost between two worlds. Damon immediately recognized his father's handwriting, and his hands trembled slightly as he held the paper that confirmed his decades-old suspicions. The revelation that he had a younger brother in Baltimore was received with absolute silence. Damon stepped away from the car, wiped his dirty hands on his work shirt, and walked to the garage window, looking at the street without really seeing anything. He had gone through so many disappointments over the years, investigators who promised answers but delivered only more questions, that part of him hesitated to believe completely. Jerome respected the moment, knowing he was witnessing the exact instant when Damon's life changed forever. When Damon finally turned around, there were tears in his eyes, but also a determination that Jerome immediately recognized. This time, he felt it was real. Jerome called Tank with the news he had been waiting to hear. Damon was not only willing to meet his brother, but had spent his entire life dreaming of this moment. He had asked for just 1 week to process the information and prepare his family for what was to come. Tank, who had spent sleepless nights imagining possible rejections, felt a wave of relief and nervousness that left him dizzy. In a week, he would finally meet the brother he never knew existed, and neither of them knew how their lives would be transformed by this encounter. The week leading up to the meeting passed like a slow-motion movie for Tank. Every training session seemed endless. Every meal was tasteless, and he could barely sleep thinking about what he would say to Damon. Calvin Ford finally managed to get the truth out of his pupil during a particularly tense training session, and was impressed by the complexity of the situation. He offered his house in Baltimore as a neutral location for the first meeting, an environment familiar to Tank but not intimidating for Damon. Damon was also going through his own emotional roller coaster in Norfolk. He had told Latasha about discovering his brother, and she had reacted with a mixture of excitement and concern. As the wife of a man who had always carried the pain of his father's absence, she knew how much this reunion meant to him. Together they explained to their young children that Daddy had discovered he had a brother, without going into details about boxing or fame that they wouldn't understand yet. Tank decided to keep the meeting secret from the press and social media. This was a personal matter, not a marketing opportunity or publicity stunt. He instructed Jerome to ensure that no information leaked, and even asked Calvin to maintain total discretion. The last thing he wanted was to turn the most important moment of his life into a public spectacle. Tank decided to keep the meeting secret from the press and social media. This was a personal matter, not a marketing opportunity or publicity stunt. He instructed Jerome to ensure that no information leaked, and even asked Calvin to maintain total discretion. The last thing he wanted was to turn the most important moment of his life into a public spectacle. The two brothers, without knowing each other, went through similar preparation rituals. Tank bought new clothes, not his typical designer pieces, but something simple and accessible that wouldn't intimidate Damon. He wanted to be seen as a brother, not as a celebrity. Damon also prepared carefully, taking time off work and mentally rehearsing what he would say at the first meeting. Jerome served as an intermediary during this week, exchanging photos and basic information between the brothers. Tank was moved to see photos of the nephews he never knew he had, while Damon was surprised to discover that his younger brother had become one of the country's most respected boxers. Neither of them, however, was prepared for the emotional intensity that awaited them. On the eve of the meeting, Tank called his mother and spent hours talking about Marcus, trying to better understand the man who had fathered two sons who grew up wondering about their identity. Kenya shared memories she had kept for decades, painting a more complex portrait of Marcus, not just as the absent father, but as a young man who was crushed by the weight of responsibilities he wasn't prepared to carry. For the first time in years, Tank was able to feel something other than anger when thinking about his father, a deep sadness for the tragedy of a family that was separated by fear and immaturity. but now had the chance to reconnect through the love between brothers. Saturday dawned gray in Baltimore, with heavy clouds threatening rain at any moment. Tank arrived early at Calvin's house, 2 hours before the scheduled time, unable to stay still in his own home. He paced back and forth in the living room, constantly checking his phone and adjusting the simple shirt he had chosen for the occasion. Calvin prepared strong coffee and watched his pupil with the same attention he dedicated to analyzing opponents before important fights. Damon drove from Norfolk in silence, with Latasha beside him offering words of encouragement whenever she noticed his anxiety increasing. They had left the children with Latasha's mother, deciding that the first meeting should be just between the brothers. During the 3-hour drive, Damon alternated between excitement and nervousness, imagining what it would be like to finally meet someone who shared not only his blood, but also the experience of growing up without Marcus. When Damon's car parked in front of Calvin's house, Tank felt his heart race in a way that not even the most important fights had provoked. He watched through the window as a tall, thin man got out of the vehicle, carrying the same facial features that Tank saw in the mirror every day. Damon wore faded jeans and a simple polo shirt, clearly chosen carefully for the occasion, and walked with the same confident posture that characterized Tank outside the ring. The moment they saw each other face to face at the door was one of absolute silence. Calvin had discreetly retreated to the kitchen, leaving the brothers alone to process the magnitude of the moment. Tank extended his hand first, but Damon completely ignored it and pulled him into a tight hug that lasted almost a minute. Neither could speak initially. They just held each other while decades of emotional emptiness began to be filled. When they finally separated, both had tears in their eyes. Damon was the first to break the silence, saying he had dreamed of this moment since childhood, that he had always known something was missing in his life. Tank responded that he felt the same emptiness, that no victory in the ring had managed to fill the hole left by the absence not only of his father, but of a complete family. They sat in Calvin's living room and spent the next 4 hours sharing their lives. The similarities between them were impressive and went far beyond physical appearance. Both had become young fathers. Both had a complicated relationship with the idea of fatherhood due to Marcus's absence, and both had found in sports a way to channel anger and frustration. Damon told about his sleepless nights thinking about his father, while Tank revealed how he used Marcus's image as motivation to never give up on anything. On that rainy Saturday in Baltimore, two men who had spent their lives feeling incomplete finally discovered they had never really been alone. The months following the first meeting brought a profound transformation to both brothers' lives. Tank began traveling regularly to Norfolk, not as a celebrity visiting fans, but as a dedicated uncle who wanted to know his nephews and be part of their lives. Damon introduced him to the children simply as Uncle Tank, without initially mentioning his boxing fame. To the boys, he was just Daddy's brother who told funny stories and always brought thoughtful gifts. Damon, in turn, began following Tank's fights with an emotional intensity that surprised even Latasha. He didn't watch just as a boxing fan, but as a brother who finally had someone to root for unconditionally. Tank always reserved special tickets for Damon and his family, and after each victory, the first hug he received outside the ring came from the older brother he never had. The relationship between them grew naturally, without forcing intimacy or trying to recover lost decades all at once. They established their own traditions, like monthly lunches in Baltimore, where they just talked about life, children, dreams, and the common concerns of two men in their 30s. Tank discovered that having an older brother gave him a different perspective on fatherhood. Damon had made mistakes and learned lessons that Tank could absorb without having to go through the same difficulties. The impact of the reunion also transformed both men's relationships with their own families. Tank became closer to his mother, finally understanding the difficult decisions Kenya had made to protect him as a child. Damon, in turn, was able to make peace with Marcus's story, seeing his father no longer as a villain, but as a young man who was overwhelmed by circumstances he couldn't handle properly. The friendship between Latasha and Tank's girlfriend also flourished, creating a family support network that neither brother had experienced before. Damon's children began to see Tank as an additional father figure, while Tank discovered the pleasure of being an uncle and mentor. He frequently took the boys to watch his training, not to impress them with his fame, but to teach about discipline, dedication, and the importance of never giving up on dreams. Calvin Ford watched this transformation with silent satisfaction. He had trained Tank for years and knew that despite all his professional success, there had always been an underlying sadness in his eyes. Now, for the first time, Calvin saw his pupil truly complete. Tank had found not just a brother, but a better version of himself, a man who finally understood that family isn't just about blood, but about choosing to be present in the lives of the people we love, something Marcus never managed to do, but his sons were determined to do differently. 1 year after the first meeting, Tank and Damon decided to do something neither had imagined possible. They located Marcus. Their father was living in Atlanta, working as a janitor in an office complex and carrying the weight of decades of regret. Jerome Washington had been hired again, this time to find the man who had left 2 boys wondering about their identity for more than 20 years. The meeting with Marcus was drastically different from the reunion between the brothers. There were no warm hugs or tears of joy, just a tense and necessary conversation in a neutral cafe in Atlanta. Marcus, now 52 years old and visibly marked by years of guilt, apologized not only for abandoning his sons, but for robbing them of the opportunity to grow up as brothers. Tank and Damon listened to his explanations with respect, but made it clear that forgiveness would be a long and painful process, with no guarantees of complete reconciliation. They externalized decades of hurt with dignity, but without minimizing the impact of his choices. What most impacted Marcus was discovering how his sons had become exceptional men despite his absence. Tank had achieved worldwide fame in boxing, but more importantly, had become a present and dedicated father. Damon had built a solid family and was respected in his community as a man of integrity. Both had broken the cycle of paternal abandonment that Marcus had perpetuated, choosing to be present in their own children's lives in a way he never managed. The story of the Davis-Williams brothers' reunion eventually became public, not by their choice, but because a neighbor had discreetly filmed one of their family gatherings at a Norfolk park. The man shared the video on local social media, praising the simplicity and beauty of the family moment, but the recording quickly escaped control and spread beyond the community. The video went viral, showing Tank playing with his nephews while Damon watched with a proud smile. The purity of the moment, a famous boxer simply being a loving uncle, touched millions of people who shared their own stories of separated and reunited families. Tank used the media attention responsibly, giving only one interview about the subject. He spoke about the importance of never giving up on searching for family connections and how discovering Damon had completed a part of his soul he didn't even know was missing. He emphasized that family isn't just about DNA, but about choosing to love and support unconditionally, even when it's difficult or inconvenient. Damon preferred to stay away from the spotlight, but occasionally appeared on Tank's social media, always in genuine family moments, backyard barbecues, basketball games with the children, or simply talking on the porch. These simple images became some of Tank's most liked posts because they showed not the boxing champion, but the complete man he had become through brotherly love. Today, when Tank enters the ring, he carries with him not only the determination to win, but also the joy of knowing there's someone in the stands cheering for him not because of his fame or skill, but simply because they're family. Damon in turn found in Tank not just a brother, but an example that it's possible to overcome any adversity when you have purpose and people who believe in you. Their story proves that sometimes the best things in life come when we least expect them, and that it's never too late to discover we're not alone in the world.
Leave your like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next cases.